Chapter 1. Early Life, 1954 to 1967. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born on October 29, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, a small rural town in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. From the very beginning, Pedro's life was marked by violence and trauma. His father, known for being abusive and controlling, reportedly kicked his pregnant wife in the stomach during a violent outburst. That attack resulted in Pedro being born with a bruised skull, traumatic brain injury that some later linked to his violent tendencies. Growing up in a household of domestic abuse and instability, Pedro was exposed to frequent acts of aggression, manipulation, and cruelty. He showed signs of antisocial behavior from a very young age, and by the time he was 13, he admitted to experiencing intense urges to kill. One early violent incident involved pushing an older cousin into a sugarcane press. Though the cousin survived, he lost an arm. Consequence. Pedro reportedly felt no remorse for this incident, though not fatal, foreshadowed the deeply violent path Pedro would soon follow. Chapter 2. Criminal Beginnings and First Murders, 1967 to 1973. Pedro's descent into crime began in earnest at the age of 14 when he committed his first murder. The victim, the vice mayor of Alpha. Pedro believed the vice mayor was responsible for the unjust firing of his father, a school security guard who had been accused of stealing food from the cafeteria. In an act of what Pedro believed was vigilante justice, he stole a shotgun from his grandfather and ambushed the vice mayor, shooting him in cold blood. Not long after, he killed another man he suspected of being the real thief. An act that marked Pedro as a fugitive and forced him to flee. He ended up in Mogi das Cruzes, a city in São Paulo's outskirts, where he joined local gangs and continued to engage in increasingly violent criminal behavior. He began targeting drug dealers and criminals, acting as a self-styled executioner, early form of the pattern that would later earn him comparisons to Dexter. Chapter 3. Major Murders. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's transformation from a wronged boy to a full-fledged executioner didn't happen overnight. After his first two murders, the deputy mayor who fired his father and the real killer of his cousin Pedro had tasted blood. More importantly, he had tasted control. Once he fled to São Paulo, bullets echoed through the warehouse as 7 men dropped, some before they even saw him coming. Pedro walked between their bodies and double-tapped the ones still twitching. That massacre shook Snow Paulo's underworld. Word spread of a ghost-faced killer who murdered drug dealers in cold blood. But this wasn't a vendetta. Pedro didn't take money. He didn't seize power. He simply vanished. A wedding day execution, one of Pedro's most infamous killings, took place during what should have been a celebration. His own cousin's wedding. The groom, Paulo da Roca, had molested a neighborhood girl the week before. Rumors had reached Pedro, who confronted Paulo privately. Paulo laughed it off, thinking Pedro wouldn't dare ruin the wedding. He was wrong. As the bride walked down the aisle, Pedro stepped forward from the pews, raised a concealed pistol, and shot Paulo twice in the chest. The bride's scream echoed through the chapel. Pedro didn't run. He turned to the congregation and said, "This man raped a child. If anyone here disagrees with what I've done, say it now." No one spoke. He disappeared into the crowd before police arrived. Kill list. The self-styled Avenger Pedro claimed that by the time he was arrested at age 19, he had killed over 30 people. The killings weren't random. Many were traced to abusers, corrupt police informants, and criminals who preyed on the weak. One particularly chilling story involves a known serial rapist who had evaded justice due to political connections. Pedro posed as a fellow criminal and gained access to the man's safe house. In the middle of the night, he slit his throat and left a note: "Justice for the girls." Pedro kept journals of names, not of people he killed, but people he still intended to kill. The list grew longer as he witnessed the failures of Brazil's legal system. His myth was spreading. To some, he was a nightmare. To others, he was a dark avenger, a real-life anti-hero in the mold of Dexter Morgan. Long before the show ever existed, by the time he was arrested in May 1973, he was just 19 years old, and by his own count, had murdered at least 44 people. But this was just the beginning. Asterisk. Chapter 4. Prison Killings. I Only Kill Criminals. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was finally arrested in May of 1973 after a nationwide manhunt. He was caught while trying to hide in a remote part of Minas Gerais. Unlike many fugitives, Pedro didn't resist arrest. In fact, when police arrived, he reportedly smiled and said, "It took you long enough." At the time of his arrest, he had already confessed to over 40 murders, many of which were confirmed by witnesses, surviving associates, and Pedro's own astonishing level of recall. But prison wasn't the end of his killing spree for Pedro. Incarceration simply meant being locked in a target-rich environment. The first cellmate Juan Pedro was brought into the holding facility. Officers decided to throw him into a shared cell with another murderer, an older man who had been convicted of rape and homicide. It's likely the guards thought Pedro would be scared into submission, or perhaps they simply didn't care. By morning, the cellmate was dead. Pedro had beaten him to death with a broken iron bunk support. When questioned, Pedro calmly explained, "He was a rapist. He killed a girl. I only kill criminals." The authorities responded by moving him to solitary confinement, but it didn't last. The Brazilian prison system in the 1970s and 80s was overcrowded, violent, and underfunded. There was no place to safely store a killer who had his own moral code and saw himself as judge, jury, and executioner. Pedro's rules for killing in prison Pedro became infamous for his unwritten code of conduct behind bars. He claimed that his murders followed specific rules: no killing for sport. Every target had to have a criminal record, preferably involving violence or sex crimes. No innocence. He avoided harming prisoners accused of property crimes or petty theft, unless they were abusive. Warning system. Pedro would often confront a prisoner and give them a chance to admit their crimes. If they lied or laughed, he'd kill them later. Respect guards and neutral inmates. He saw no point in attacking people who weren't directly involved in harm. This twisted moral framework gained Pedro a cult following in prison. Some feared him. Others respected him as a sort of demonic Robin Hood, the bloodbath in cell block. 3. One of the most shocking incidents took place in 1976, when Pedro was moved to a higher-risk ward in Talbot Prison. This block was infamous for housing multiple gang leaders, rapists, and murderers. Pedro killed 4 inmates in one day, according to reports. He lured one into a corner of the yard and strangled him with a wire. Later that evening, he stabbed 2 others in the showers with a sharpened toothbrush handle wrapped in tape. The final victim, a notorious pedophile, was suffocated in his sleep. When questioned by guards, Pedro reportedly shrugged and said, "If you put a dog among wolves, don't be surprised when it bites back." The prison was in chaos. Administrators requested psychiatric evaluations, but Pedro passed them. Experts found him to be sane, cold, calculating, but completely aware of his actions. In other words, he wasn't insane. He simply believed. He was right. Total prison body count: 47, confirmed over the next 30 years. Pedro would go on to kill at least 47 other prisoners. Some records place that number even higher, but the Brazilian government never publicly confirmed every case due to political concerns and public backlash. Many of these killings were carried out with homemade weapons, blunt trauma, or strangulation. Pedro rarely relied on help. He was a solo executioner, usually acting when guards weren't paying attention. In one particularly gruesome episode, Pedro reportedly carved a name into the chest of an inmate he killed, the name of a child victim. It was a brutal message to others. "I know what you did." The man who killed his own father, perhaps Pedro's most disturbing prison murder, was the one that blurred the lines of personal vengeance. In 1979, Pedro was informed that his own father, who had been jailed for murdering Pedro's mother with a machete, was being held in the same prison facility. The father had stabbed her over 20 times in a drunken rage, and Pedro had sworn revenge ever since. Pedro asked to visit him during the visit. He smuggled in a blade hidden in a Bible. He stabbed his father 22 times, one for each wound his mother had suffered. Then, in a moment of macabre finality, Pedro reportedly cut open his father's chest and removed part of his heart, chewing on it before spitting it out. This event solidified Pedro's reputation across Brazil and the world. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the symbolic nature of the act. A man who lived by his own law had just executed his own father in the name of justice. Chapter 5: Release and the YouTube Era. From killer to content creator. After spending 34 years behind bars, Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Brazil's most notorious serial killer, was released in 2007. His freedom was not due to a clerical error or pardon. In fact, it was entirely legal. At the time, Brazil's maximum prison sentence, regardless of how many murders a person committed, was capped at 30 years. A few additional years were tacked on due to disciplinary issues, but even with those, Pedro had served his full term. It was a controversial moment. The families of victims were horrified. Psychiatrists were stunned. The media had a field day. How could a man who admitted to over 100 murders simply walk free? Pedro, for his part, walked out of Taubate prison not in chains, but in sunglasses and a baseball cap, grinning as he passed reporters. A killer's new beginning. Upon his release, Pedro claimed he was done with violence. In interviews, he insisted that he had found God while in prison, and that he now wanted to use his life to help others avoid the mistakes he made. It was difficult to reconcile this soft-spoken, articulate man with the brutal murderer who had stabbed, strangled, and butchered his way through decades of criminal history. Still, Pedro had something most criminals didn't: charisma. His interviews went viral. He didn't shy away from his past. In fact, he leaned into it. He spoke with a mixture of regret and pride, often describing his murders in graphic detail, while simultaneously condemning crime. He once said, "I never killed for pleasure. I killed because it was necessary. But if I can stop others from going down the same road, then maybe my story will serve a purpose." The birth of Pedrinho X Matador. By 2018, Pedro had started his own YouTube channel, titled Pedrinho X Matador, which translates roughly to Little Pedro, the former killer. What began as a small vlog quickly snowballed into a full-blown digital platform. With over 200,000 subscribers at its peak, Pedro shared personal stories of life in prison, opinions on Brazil's legal system, cautionary tales for young people, spiritual messages and reflections on morality, shocking commentary on recent criminal events. Each video was hosted by Pedro himself, often seated in front of a plain background, wearing sunglasses and speaking with blunt honesty. He rarely edited his footage. He didn't need to. His personality was raw, magnetic, and unfiltered. He addressed everything from how he built prison weapons to his thoughts on capital punishment. Some videos received millions of views. Controversy and online famed YouTube era brought Pedro renewed fame, but not everyone was supportive. Critics accused him of glorifying his past. Some called for his channel to be banned. Others accused him of profiting off of trauma. Pedro responded the only way he knew how, with honesty. "I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm not going to lie and pretend it didn't happen. If my story scares someone into staying clean, then it was worth it." Despite the backlash, Pedro became a strange kind of folk hero to many in Brazil, especially in lower-income communities that had experienced abuse from criminals and police alike. Some saw him as a man who had paid his dues and was now using his platform for good. Pedro's code in the internet-aged Pedro continued to insist that his killing days were over. He claimed that he now followed the law and had learned to control his impulses. Yet, the darkness never left completely. In several interviews, he hinted that he still carried knives for self-defense. He also admitted to having violent thoughts, especially when seeing reports of child abuse or femicide. The message was always the same: "I'm not a hero. I'm a man who was broken, and I don't want others to break the same way." Pedro began working with churches and community centers, giving talks about violence and redemption. He even published a memoir with the help of a journalist, detailing his life in greater depth than ever before. But just as his second life was gaining momentum, tragedy struck. Chapter 6. The assassination of a killer. Pedro's violent end. On the morning of March 5, 2023, Pedro Rodrigues Filho, once known as Pedrinho Matador, Brazil's most prolific and morally twisted serial killer, was gunned down in cold blood. He was 68 years old. His death wasn't unexpected by those who knew him, but it was violent, public, and delivered with brutal precision, eerily similar to the dozens of executions Pedro had committed in his own youth. In many ways, it felt like the last page of a blood-soaked novel finally being turned. The attack Pedro had moved to Mogi das Cruzes, a quiet suburb in the state of São Paulo, where he lived with a small circle of acquaintances. He maintained a low profile outside his online presence, reportedly attending church and living a quiet life off YouTube revenue and government assistance. On that March morning, Pedro stepped outside his home to speak with someone on the street. It was daylight. Security footage shows him speaking casually to a man before a black car, a white Fiat Strada. According to investigators pulled up alongside him, two masked men jumped out of the vehicle. Within seconds, at least 4 gunshots rang out. Pedro was hit in the chest, neck, and shoulder. His companions screamed and ran, but the gunmen calmly returned to their vehicle and sped off. Pedro bled out on the pavement. He was dead before medics arrived. The aftermath and autopsy news of his murder spread fast. The scene was quickly sealed off, and videos of his body lying in a pool of blood were posted online. Despite the graphic nature, many Brazilians shared the footage, stunned that the country's most infamous killer had himself become a victim. The autopsy confirmed multiple gunshot wounds, none of which appeared to be fired in haste. This wasn't a chaotic shooting, it was a planned assassination. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Whoever killed Pedro knew exactly what they were doing and likely studied his routine. The attackers left no fingerprints, no traceable bullet casings, and no witnesses brave enough to testify. The symbolism wasn't lost on the public. A man who had killed over 70 criminals, many of them shot or stabbed in cold blood, had been executed in the street, just like the ones he once hunted, who killed Pedro Rodrigues Filho. As of today, the murder remains unsolved, but theories abound. Gang retaliation. Pedro made many enemies over the years, both inside and outside prison. He had openly criticized major criminal factions, including the Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, Brazil's most powerful gang. Family revenge. Pedro killed dozens of men, rapists, abusers, and suspected criminals. Some had families who swore vengeance. Investigators have explored the possibility that a relative of one of his victims finally took action. Vigilante. Irony, the cruelest irony of all. Pedro, who considered himself a vigilante killer, may have been executed by another vigilante, someone who saw Pedro as evil incarnate, not a reformed man, but a butcher who didn't deserve the platform he had built. Police released few details. No suspects were arrested. No claims of responsibility ever surfaced. It was a clean hit, likely professional. Public reaction, mourning or relief. Brazil was divided. Some mourned him as a reformed man who had paid his debt to society and was using his life to educate others. Others celebrated, calling it karma for a man who had escaped justice too many times. A few were simply shocked. How could a man so dangerous and yet so careful be brought down on his own front step? YouTube exploded with tributes and controversy. His channel, which remained online for a time, gained thousands of subscribers. In the days following his death, several church leaders who had worked with Pedro called for peace and forgiveness. His funeral, held under police guard, was sparsely attended but broadcast online. No one claimed his body publicly for days. Legacy, monster, or messenger? Pedro Rodrigues Filho was more than a serial killer. He was a mirror of the broken systems that birthed him. He came from poverty, abuse, and violence. The society that tried to rehabilitate him never fully knew what to make of him. Was he evil? Was he a product of his environment? Or was he both? He claimed to regret his past, but never apologized for his code. He died like so many of his victims, without trial, without mercy. And just like that, the story of Brazil's real-life Dexter Morgan came to an end, not with a redemption arc, but with gunfire echoing across a quiet street. Chapter 7: Legacy, Psychology, and Final Impact. Unmasking the real Pedrinho Matador. In the wake of Pedro Rodrigues Filho's assassination, the world was left to wrestle with a single, unrelenting question. Who was he, really? Was he a monster, a folk hero, a cautionary tale, a reformed man, or a criminal who manipulated society until the very end? To truly answer that, we need to step back and look beyond the headlines, to examine the complex layers of his mind, his public image, and the ripple effects of his life on Brazilian society and criminal justice. The making of a killer, the psychology of Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Pedro's brain was not like most people's. Psychiatrists who evaluated him during and after his imprisonment reported several key psychological traits: antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, marked by disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, and a tendency toward manipulation; borderline narcissism. He craved attention and often viewed himself as morally superior to the people he killed. Hyperaggression. Pedro didn't just react to threats, he sought them out. His instinct was violence, sharpened by trauma. Obsessive-compulsive control, especially regarding his internal code of only killing bad people. Despite these diagnoses, Pedro consistently passed basic intelligence and emotional reasoning tests. He was not insane in the legal sense. He understood right from wrong. He simply believed he was above it. In interviews, Pedro often described himself as someone born in violence. His father had nearly killed his mother while she was pregnant. He grew up surrounded by abuse, death, and hunger. By the age of 13, he had already witnessed multiple murders in his neighborhood. Psychologists believe his violent environment, paired with potential frontal lobe trauma from childhood beatings, may have short-circuited the part of his brain that governs impulse control and empathy. One psychiatrist, who spent years studying Pedro in prison, wrote, "Pedro doesn't kill for thrill. He kills with purpose. But that purpose comes from a deeply damaged soul that can no longer understand peace without violence." The myth and media machine. Pedro wasn't just a killer, he was a brand. In the age of YouTube, he transitioned into something new, a true crime celebrity. He gave interviews to Brazilian podcasts. His stories became clickbait. He inspired fan art, short films, music tracks, and even a rumored Netflix pitch. To some, he became Brazil's Dexter Morgan, a real-world version of the fictional vigilante who only kills the guilty. But the truth was far more disturbing. Dexter is a scripted character with strict ethical rules. Pedro's rules bent often. He killed drug addicts, petty thieves, and people based on hearsay. Some of his victims may have been innocent, yet the myth persisted, in part because Pedro leaned into it. He told stories with flair. He smiled when he talked about killings. He was open, charismatic, and knew exactly how to hold attention. His rise also reflected a deeper frustration within Brazil, a sense that the criminal justice system had failed, and only vigilantes could provide real justice. Pedro tapped into that collective rage. He became the walking embodiment of a system people had lost faith in. Cultural impact. From favela to philosophy, Pedro's story has been used in a variety of strange places. University lectures on criminal psychology, law enforcement seminars on rehabilitation and parole risks, ethics discussions in philosophy classes across Latin America. His life became a case study in moral ambiguity. Can someone who committed evil ever truly change? Do intentions matter more than actions? Is society partly responsible for creating its monsters? In the favelas of Brazil, where corruption and crime are everyday realities, some still idolize Pedro, not because they approve of murder, but because he represented direct justice in a world where courts often protect the rich and punish the poor. Redemption or reinvention? Pedro claimed to have found redemption. He spoke of God, forgiveness, and using his platform to steer youth away from violence. But critics argue that he merely reinvented himself to stay relevant. After all, he never expressed deep remorse for his victims. He never paid financial restitution to the families, and he monetized his story without any filters, earning ad revenue from discussing murders he had committed decades earlier. To others, though, his brutal honesty was his redemption. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He didn't ask for pity. He shared his journey as a broken man trying to live a different ending. The law, after Pedro's case, helped spark national debate in Brazil about prison term limits, rehabilitation of violent offenders, the legality of monetizing crimes through media platforms, the blurred line between public education and exploitation. In 2019, the Brazilian government amended the criminal code, raising the maximum sentence from 30 to 40 years, largely in response to public pressure from high-profile cases like Some even proposed Pedro's law, legislation preventing violent criminals from profiting off their crimes through media. It was never passed, but the conversation lingers. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was a paradox wrapped in blood-stained charisma. His legacy, like his life, is polarizing. He murdered over 70 people. He was loved by some, loathed by many, and he died as violently as he lived, a shadow figure of justice, consequence, and contradiction. Chapter 8. Reflections, Morality, and the real Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Pedro Rodrigues Filho lived in a strange space between nightmare and myth, a man who confessed to dozens of murders and walked free in his later years, only to die violently at the hands of a still unidentified assassin. As the dust settled on his chaotic life, one truth remained unshakable. No one will ever fully agree on who Pedro truly was. This chapter serves as the ultimate reflection, a step back from the blood, the prisons, the headlines, and the YouTube thumbnails. What lessons can be taken from his life? What does it say about justice, redemption, and the society that both created and consumed his story? Was Pedro a monster? The answer seems obvious. A man who took more than 70 lives, often in brutal, premeditated fashion, must be a monster. And yet, Pedro didn't fit the mold of the typical serial killer. He didn't kill for sexual gratification. He didn't stalk random victims. He often sought out people accused of domestic abuse, rape, and betrayal. He claimed a code similar to the fictional Dexter Morgan, where he only targeted the guilty. But Pedro's victims weren't always confirmed criminals. Some were killed based on rumors, revenge, or hearsay. Some were killed in prison, where proper trials never occurred. There was no oversight, no appeals, no certainty, only Pedro's personal judgment. To justify his actions, he once said, "If I don't kill the killer, who will? The police. They're slower than death itself." A chilling rationalization, perhaps even sociopathic. And yet, some would argue that in a country plagued by systemic corruption and inefficient justice systems, Pedro was not a monster. He was a byproduct, a symptom of a society in pain. Was he ever truly reformed? Pedro's post-prison life painted a surreal picture. A YouTuber recounting graphic murders to an audience of millions, sometimes with jokes, sometimes with pride, sometimes with alarming detachment. He claimed to be reformed. He claimed faith in God had changed him. He told his followers, "I've paid my debt. I've walked through hell. Now I'm here to teach others not to follow my path." But for critics, the performative nature of his online persona suggested that Pedro had merely adapted to modern fame, turning his crimes into entertainment content. It's worth asking, if a man profits from telling stories of murder, is that rehabilitation or exploitation? Can someone be redeemed if they never show genuine remorse? His fans believed he had changed. Victims' families believed he had never paid enough. A death that said everything. On March 5, 2023, Pedro was gunned down on the street in broad daylight, moments after visiting his mother. He was 68. The gunman arrived in a black vehicle, fired multiple times, and vanished without a trace. Pedro's body was left bleeding on the pavement, his death captured by nearby security cameras and broadcast to the world within hours. It was as if fate itself had finally caught up. A man who lived by the gun died by it. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Some called it karma, others called it murder, but no one called it unjustified. He killed so many, he was bound to be killed. A comment on a Brazilian news site hours after his death. Even in death, Pedro divided opinion, society's complicity, and the obsession with anti-heroes. Pedro's case shines a spotlight on a darker side of human nature, our fascination with violence. Why did millions subscribe to his channel? Why did producers offer to tell his story? Why did fans call him a legend? The answer lies in the way society often glamorizes anti-heroes, people who break the law, exact revenge, and live without apology. Characters like Tony Montana, Walter White, Dexter Morgan, the Joker. Pedro was their real-world reflection, messy, inconsistent, but undeniably magnetic. It wasn't justice that drew people in. It was the chaos, the audacity, the narrative. His story was cinema, only it was real. The final legacy Pedro Rodrigues Filho left behind. Over 70 murders across 40 years, a reformed life, or a rebranded one. Millions of fans who followed his YouTube channel, a murder scene that mirrored the violence he once inflicted, a country still debating what justice really means. His grave marker is simple. There's no tribute, no honor, just a name, a date, and silence. But his life and the contradictions it held will echo far longer than his time on Earth. Epilogue: real evil or real justice? As a story, Pedro's life is unlike any other. He was abused, then became an abuser. He was a victim, then a vigilante. He was caged, then celebrated. He was feared, then followed. In trying to understand him, we're really trying to understand ourselves. Why do we crave vengeance? Why do we forgive monsters if they smile and speak well? And most importantly, can justice ever truly be served by the hands of a killer? Only history will judge Pedro Rodrigues Filho, and perhaps that's the final twist, that the real story never ends.